The first vote took 30 minutes. So let's try to stick to what we always said we would do. People wait around here. It's not fair to everybody else. So as soon as we get enough votes here, we can move on. We're going to move on whether everybody's here or not.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back, and the question occurs on the Schiffer nomination. Is there a sufficient second? Appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Sir?
No. I'm on it. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. No. You can it is. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich.
My vote's no.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Moran. Thank you. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. I got you. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Murphy. Yes. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Ms. Cantwell. Gotcha. Great, I gotcha. I gotcha. Mr. Lindsay. I gotcha.
Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp.
Shut her down, Madam President.
Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota.
Sanders, yes.
Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar.
Of the Russell, you know which is the Russell. 47. You have to knock on the list.
Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson.
We have a little difficulty in there, too. Some of us want to open Yucca and some of us don't. How are we going to resolve it?
There's good luck and bad luck. That's bad luck.
Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch,
No.
Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Ms. Collins, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. You haven't voted yet. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye.
No.
Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Harkin, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their votes? If not, the ayes are 54, the nays are 44, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Mark Gaston Pearce of New York to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the Pearce nomination.
Madam President, I ask
Senator
consent
from
that
Iowa.
I ask consent that all time be yielded back.
Is there objection? Without objection. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Mark Gaston Pearce of New York to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board for the term of 5 years expiring August 27, 2018, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Thank you, sir. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson.
What's that gavel for, anyway?
Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Soon, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Corker, Durbin, Feinstein, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hirono, Isaacson, Johnson, South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Markey, McCain, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Schatz, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wicker. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, Moran, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, and Vitter. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr? No. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no.
Any senator wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? On this vote, the yeas are 69, the nays are 29. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is yielded back, and the question occurs on the Pearce nomination. Yeas and nays. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich.
That's it, last vote, right?
Mr. Bennett.
Where have you been?
Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven,
Did you record Nelson?
Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Hirono, Isaacson, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Harkin, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye.
Any senator wishing to vote or to change his or her vote? If not, the ayes are 59, the nays are 38. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the question occurs on the Johnson nomination. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the question occurs on the Ms. Camara nomination. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be notified immediately of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Report the bill. Report the bill. What's pending? Say what's
Madam President,
Washington.
what is the pending business?
The clerk will report the pending business.
Calendar number 99 is 1243, a bill making appropriations for the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development and so forth, and for other purposes.
Madam President.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the following amendments be in order and the Senate proceed to their consideration en bloc. Flake, number 1818, Flake, number 1772, McCaskill, Blunt, number 1800, Blumenthal, number 1809, Menendez, number 1812, and Cochran, number 1814.
Is there an objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, it is with great regret that on behalf of Senator Coburn, I am objecting. I want to point out that we've worked very hard to clear this list of amendments, and they include amendments from members on both sides of the aisle. It's a fair list, and I had hoped that we would be able to proceed tonight. Regrettably, there is an objection on our side from Senator Coburn. I am, however, optimistic that with further work we will be able to deal with that objection, and my hope is that in the morning we will have an agreement that will allow me to agree on, as the manager on our side, to this list. But unfortunately, at this time, I do need to object.
Ms. Hurd.
I suggest yes to the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate just confirming Kent Hirazawa and 4 other nominees as members of the National Labor Relations Board. We just heard Senator Susan Collins objecting. CQ Roll Call writes that Senate Republican leaders intend to block passage of the fiscal 2014 Transportation HUD Appropriations Bill, now on the floor, in order to emphasize their objections to Democratic spending levels ahead of a larger September budget battle on a broad stopgap funding bill. The story goes on to say that Democrats had proceeded with annual appropriations bills as if the sequester were no longer in effect, and the cap on fiscal 2014 discretionary spending would be restored to its original $1.58 trillion level. A Senate Republican Conference Chairman John Thune of South Dakota said today that Republicans intend to, quote, draw a line in the sand to highlight their opposition to that approach. That again in CQ Roll Call. Tomorrow, in addition to live House and Senate coverage, we'll also be live with a hearing on surveillance programs. A Senate Judiciary Committee will hear from officials from the Justice Department, National Security Agency, the National Intelligence Director's Office, FBI, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Our live coverage begins tomorrow morning at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN 3. And later in the day at 3 Eastern, a ceremony honoring the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. That'll be held at the U.S. Capitol, also on C-SPAN 3.
Majority Leader.